the Wednesday class that shall not be named. We're here on YouTube and Zoom. I'll say it again because I don't always know when YouTube starts. Welcome everybody to the Wednesday class that shall not be named. We got a bunch of people here on our last one for 2024. So welcome to everybody who's on Zoom, including Michael and David and Karen and Eva and Genevieve and Stuart and Flossie. I think Bubba's on here. Arnold may be on here as well, even though their cameras are off. So we hope everybody is a good one. Last week, we talked about the theoretical evolution. Well, some of it's not theoretical because the more modern stuff is not, but the evolution of Hanukkah and the belief that Hanukkah started out as a one-time Sukkot celebration when the temple was rededicated, became a second Sukkot in Jerusalem every year, then a second Sukkot everywhere every year, then became a holiday to celebrate the Maccabees. This is over 200 years. And then 300 years later became a holiday to celebrate God with the Talmudic story of course, oil. So we're going to talk a little bit about Hanukkah and some of the traditions. We'll look at some of the texts, maybe a few that I talked about. Again, Hanukkah is not a major holiday, but Stuart.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that one of the things that we didn't talk about at all last week, Karen's more expert on this than I am, is the role of, you should excuse the expression, KKBE, in the way Hanukkah is celebrated in the modern United States. Because a lot of that really came from a teacher at KKBE whose students were questioning Hanukkah versus Christmas, and she's the one who instituted a lot of the more modern music and the more modern tradition.
That's great, and Karen sent me that information, so we definitely could talk about that. That's a great idea, because this is really before what we think of as the evolution of Hanukkah as a major holiday celebration happened. So that's in the 1840s. So we'll invite Karen to talk about that a little bit as we go along as well.
You wrote an article, didn't you, Karen?
I did, and I had sent it to Rabbi Haas last week.
She's going to say some of the stuff too. So
Yeah.
we'll put that in there. I think that's awesome. That's a really not only interesting topic, but because of where we live. So
Can I just mention, clarify,
Please.
For those who don't know, KKBE is Kehillat Kaha.
Kehilat,
It's the synagogue in Charleston.
yeah, Kehilat Kodesh.
Yeah, Kahal, yeah. Beth Elohim.
We used to be KKMI, Kehilat.
Okay, Mikveh Israel, right.
These are the congregation. They never
But
did.
that's what he's referring to.
Yeah. So that's
Okay.
the synagogue in Charleston, which is the fifth oldest synagogue, but their Jewish community predates ours. It's a wonderful place. They have a wonderful, not as good as ours, but really wonderful. And the synagogue is spectacular. It's a Greek revival. It is the second oldest synagogue building in America after Truro. Newport, which is the oldest, but that's pretty impressive. So it's around the 1840s. So what we're looking at is Hanukkah in the text. And of course, when we light the Hanukkah candles starting on the 25th, we have 3 prayers the first night, and then 2 prayers every other night, because we say Shechianu, the prayer for celebration, but you only say that one time per holiday. So that's so we'll say 3 prayers the first night. During Hanukkah, this is another extra. We add this prayer into the Amidah, which we say at services, and Birkat Hamazon, the prayer you say after eating food, which again, what harkens to the idea that Hanukkah may have had Sukkot origins, and that's how it got put in the central prayer in Judaism. And it's a prayer that says, we're grateful for the miracles You performed the mighty deeds, the victories of our ancestors. But let's read a little bit more clearly. In the days of Mattathias, son of Yochanan, the high priest, the Hasmoneans, the dynasty of the Maccabees. The Maccabees was not their names, that was their moniker. Flossie, are you calling me? Do you want to get off mute? I'm going to ask you to unmute Flossie, and you can just print. Do we lose her? 1 second. Hey, Flossie, did we lose you?
Just lost her picture.
I think she accidentally called me. In the days of Mattathias, the high priest, the Hasmoneans, the sons, when the evil Greek kingdom arose against your people Israel, they make them forget your Torah and to cause them to transgress the laws that you willed in your great mercy. You stood by them in their times of distress. You fought their struggle, judged their claim, and retaliated on their behalf. Pay attention to what they're talking about, specifically who they're saying thanks to. You delivered the strong into the hands of the weak, the many into the hands of the few, the impure into the hands of the pure, the evil into the hands of the righteous, and the wanton in the hands of those who are occupied with the study of your Torah and for you yourself. You made a great and sanctified name in your world, and as for your nation, Israel, you wrought a great victory and deliverance, even this very day. Afterwards, your children entered the precincts of your house, cleared out your sanctuary from the idols, purified your temple, kindled the lights in the courtyard, your holy place, and they designated these 8 nights Hanukkah. Who is this prayer thanking? One being only, and that is God. That's the only you. Think about it. You willed, not the Maccabees willed. You fought. Who's the you? It's not the Maccabees. It's a singular. It could be plural. It's God. This is you delivered your Torah for the sake of your Torah, your world you made and sanctified. So the prayer, again, already by the time the Amidah has come out, the Maccabees want to make sure we know that Hanukkah is a celebration of who? God. God's miracle. So even though the Maccabees, this is possibly and probably a prayer that comes before we know the story, maybe of the light that lasted for 8 days. They don't mention that. The rabbis who were not fans of the Maccabees wanted to make sure that God is thanked. This is another piece to the theory of the evolution of Hanukkah, that the rabbis couldn't delete it, wanted it to be more about God, which is nice. But they do mention in the times of Mattathias, son of Yochanan, the high priest, that's the father of Judah and the Maccabees, rose against your people. I forgot to, that you willed in your great mercy. You stood by them in times of distress. You fought. So it's all about God fighting. And that is a really obvious change from the holiday we saw at the time of Josephus, which stressed the Maccabees. Now we're stressing God. And it's a unique difference, but I think it just adds to the flavor that they wanted to stress God as opposed to the Maccabees, as the Maccabees were not the rabbi's favorite people. Now we continue into the text, the Babylonian Talmud. We talked about last week. This is the first. Stuart, did you have a question or just raise your hand?
Yeah. It strikes me that Purim has, in a sense, a similar thing of a fight against oppression by individuals. Hanukkah becomes very God-centric. In the Purim story in the Megillah, God is not mentioned at all. I don't know whether you want to speak to that today, but I find that distinction very interesting.
That's a very good point, something I should have brought up. Purim and Hanukkah are related because they're the two most well-known holidays outside of the major ones. Purim does not, it's one of the only books that doesn't mention God in the Bible, maybe the only book that doesn't mention God.
I think it's the only.
But the rabbis were not in competition with the family of Mordecai and Esther. The story, although written later, harkens back to a time of the Persian period, way before the Maccabees. The Maccabees had no beef with Mordecai and Esther, even though they weren't religious. This is not a warrior tale at the beginning. This is a convincing type of tale, although there are battles at the end. And most importantly, they may have known this at the time, Purim is a farce. It is a story that is ridiculous in many ways. It's also not a story of religious persecution. The Jews are not being persecuted because they're Jewish by Haman. They're being persecuted because Haman has a beef with an individual. And not only is it a beef with the individual shows him up before the king. So it's an excellent point because these two holidays are very connected. But again, the Maccabees is in many ways, the lifespan of the rabbis in terms of memory, although not literally in their lifespan. But the Pharisee-Sadducee rivalry, the disavowalment by the Maccabees of what they were fighting for, they became very Greek, in some cases corrupt, not all of them. So this is why the rabbis really wanted to make sure that Hanukkah was about God, but Purim again is a fun, farcical holiday. And I don't think they probably saw it that way, but I don't know. Maybe they tried, but you're right. It is they mention it a lot. They'll mention that God is really what does it for them, but they don't stress it as much during the holiday. And as we read the entire book of Esther, the book of Esther made it into the Bible, whereas the two books of Maccabees, we'll look at some of it, did not. The Maccabees books were written later. However, by the time the rabbis chose which books went in the Bible, both books of the Maccabees had been written for probably 200 years earlier. So they had the books of the Maccabees in front of them, probably. They had the book of Esther definitively, and they said the Maccabees are not going in, and Purim is. That's the book of Esther is. And they had other books that you would think would not have made it in, like Song of Songs especially, but those made it in and the Maccabees didn't. And Song of Songs can be a little lucid, a little difficult sometimes, and it's erotic almost. Excellent point. So let's look at the Babylonian Talmud Shabbat 21b. Is it under the tractate Hanukkah? No, it's under the tractate Shabbat. What is the reason for Hanukkah? This is the first time now, as you look up here. Oh, you could have kept that. As you look up here, you can get some candy if you want some. You see the Talmud is written sometime between the 3rd and completed in the 6th century. So sometime the 240s, 250s to 500-ish, a little bit later. So we don't know exactly when this story got in there. It could have been in, let's say, 250, which would have made it only 150 years, 170 years after Josephus, but pretty late. So sometime in here, they wrote, the story comes out. Anybody want to read this, by the way? I'm happy to, but if anybody wants to. What is the reason for Hanukkah? This is the first time, I believe, we see the name Hanukkah. As our rabbis taught on the 25th of Kislev, which is the day the Maccabees decided we'd be second Sukkot, the 8 days of Hanukkah began. How long is Sukkot? 8 days.
8 days, right.
During which it is forbidden to eulogize the dead or to fast. For when the Greeks entered the sanctuary of the temple, they defiled all of the oil. The Asmoneans overpowered them and were victorious. They searched but could only find one cruse of oil that was intact with the seal of the high priest. It contained only a sufficient oil to kindle the menorah for one day, but a miracle occurred, and they were able to light with it. So that's probably the direct. Let's say lighted for 8 days. The next year, they designated these days as a festival with the recitation of hymns of praise and thanksgiving. Okay, now there is no proof of any of this earlier than this. We don't know. The next year they designated these days as a festival. That is true. We see that in the book of Maccabees, although they called it something different. The recitation of hymns and praise and thanksgiving, they probably had something, but again, so that is the first time we see Hanukkah. They say it as if people have been doing it for a long time. We cannot prove they have not. Certainly Hanukkah could have been something that came out hundreds of years ago. We just don't have any reference to it outside of the book of Maccabees. I mean, we have no reference to it outside of this Hanukkah, the name Hanukkah and the oil until this Talmudic verse. Now let's look at the Maccabees. Now what's wonderful about the Maccabees, which as we said, the Hanukkah is so much more recent that we have more information. And we believe that the first book of the Maccabees was written only 50 years after the event it describes. Why is that important? Because the people writing it probably have a first-hand account. Either they were living during the times or they are talking to people who lived during the times. There's very likely there were people who were living still at this time or who told stories to them from a first-person account, which is incredible because we don't know if that happens anywhere else in our biblical books. We don't know if that's the case in any of them. In fact, in many cases, we believe the stories were written centuries later, maybe even a millennia later. Maybe not millennium later, maybe. But here, this book is only written 50 years, maybe even less. It could be in the 40s. And so we have first-hand accounts or second-hand accounts getting first-hand accounts of this. And that's incredible for us as a people to have this kind of history because, you know, our history is just too old to have these kinds of so let's go ahead and read this as I fix this. We're going to read a little bit from the book of Maccabees. Again, not in the Bible. It's in the section called the Apocrypha. The Apocrypha is in the Catholic Bible, but was taken out by the founder of what's his name? Martin
Luther.
Martin Luther took out the Apocrypha thinking Jews would then become Protestant because he rationed that, well, the Protestants added all these books into the Old Testament. Of course, the Jews are not going to be Catholic. We take the Apocrypha out and they will then be Protestant. And he was not happy when we said no, to say the least. Then Judas said to his brothers, "Behold, our enemies are crushed. Let us go up to cleanse the sanctuary and dedicate it." So all the army assembled, and they went up to Mount Zion. And they saw the sanctuary desolate, the altar profane, and the gates burned. In the courts they saw bushes sprung up as in a thicket, or as on one of the mountains. They saw also the chambers of the priests in ruins. Then they rent their clothes, and we'll fix this, and mourned with great lamentation, and sprinkled themselves with ashes. They fell down on the ground and sounded the signals of the trumpets. You notice they don't say shofars. In Hebrew, it may be shofars. And cried out to heaven. Then Judah detailed men to fight against those in the citadel until they had cleansed the sanctuary. So it shows they didn't just take over right away. They took it, but they're still fighting inside. There's still people doing hand-to-hand fighting even as they're cleansing the sanctuary. He chose blameless priests devoted to the law, and they cleansed the sanctuary and removed the defiled stones to an unclean place. They deliberated what to do about the altar of burnt offering, which had been profaned, and they thought it best to tear it down, lest it bring reproach upon them, for the Gentiles had defiled it. So, what does this tell us about the altar of burnt offering that was destroyed by the Romans in the year 70? That is not the altar built by Nehemiah and Ezra, or maybe those who came earlier. So the altar is a new one, which they had every right to do because it had been defiled. But let's remember, in the year 70, the temple's burned down. So the altar they originally had, and they thought it best to tear it down lest it bring reproach upon them, for the Gentiles. So they tore down the altar and stored the stones in a convenient place on the temple hill, and until there should come a prophet to tell what to do with them. What does this tell us? The temple was burned by the Romans. What does this tell us about something doing to the temple? There may be pieces to the altar somewhere that we don't know where it is. And it's never been found. And if they do find it, they may not be able to figure out what it is. But it tells us that there may be some stuff out there we haven't found yet. And there's come a prophet to tell them what to do with them. Then they took unhewn stones, as the law directs, and built a new altar like the former one. They also rebuilt the sanctuary and the interior of the temple and consecrated the courts. They made new holy vessels and brought the menorah, the altar of incense, and table into the temple. What does this tell us also? The Romans took all the vessels after they burnt the temple, destroyed them. But what does it tell us? The vessels that were made by Ezra and Nehemiah in the 5th century, and the people who helped rebuild the Second Temple in the 6th century, they may still exist somewhere. And that is incredible. Bubba says the Romans have it, the Arch of Titus, exactly, and that's a good point. In the Arch of Titus, which is the arch in Rome, which depicts Titus taking the Israelites prisoners, he has the menorah. Supposedly they took the utensils, except that the Maccabees had switched out the old utensils for new ones. So presumably the Romans had the Maccabees' new utensils. They weren't new anymore, they were 20 years old. So that means the utensils that had been defiled by the Greeks may still be out there somewhere, buried. They may have burnt them down or whatever and destroyed them, but they may not have, it doesn't say. So there may be holy vessels that were used in the temple still out there, not the ones the Romans still have. Which, I mean, that's in the Catholics, who knows who has them. Okay, all right. They burn incense on the altar and lighted the lamps. Let's just put lit the lamps on the menorah, and these gave light in the temple. They placed the bread on the table and hung the curtains. Thus, they finished all the work they had undertaken early morning, the 25th day of the 9th of the month, which is the month of Kislev, and the 148th year they rose up and offered. So I'm sorry, I'll fix this later. They had built, okay. At the very season, on the very day that the Gentiles had profaned, it was dedicated with songs and harps and lutes and cymbals. And the people fell on their faces and worshipped and blessed heaven, who had caused them to succeed. So they celebrated the dedication of the altar for 8 days and offered burnt offerings with gladness. They offered a sacrifice of celebration and thanksgiving. They decorated the front of the temple with golden crowns and small shields. They rededicated the gates and the chambers for the priests and furnished them with doors. So they did. This was a great gladness among the people, and the reproach of the Gentiles were removed. Then Judah's brothers and all the assembly of Israel determined that every year at the season, the days of dedication should be observed with gladness, joy for 8 days, beginning the 25th in the month of Kislev. So, this is the story of what is going on. In another place, it talks about how they're doing Sukkot, but this one gives us a lot of information. Now, let's go to the second book of the Maccabees. This is written much later. This is written the second half of the 1st century BCE. So 50 BCE or later. This is not in living memory. The other one, the first book, is written maybe as early as 40 to 50 years after. This one is more than 100 years. So nobody in living memory, probably. So a lot of things have changed by this time. Maccabees are different people. And let's read what they say. And this is written in Greek. Now Maccabeus and his followers, the Lord leading them on, recovered the temple and the city. They tore down the altars which had been built in the public square by the foreigners and destroyed the sacred precincts. They purified the sanctuary and made another altar of sacrifice. Then, striking fire out in the flint, they offered sacrifices. After a lapse of 2 years, they burned incense and lighted. I'm gonna just change light and lit lamps and set out the bread of the presence. And when they had done this, they fell prostrate and besought the Lord that might never again fall into such misfortune.
Prostrate now. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, they're bound down. But that if they should ever sin, they might be disciplined by him with forbearance and not be handed over to blasphemous and barbarous nations. It happens on that same day on which the sanctuary was profaned by the foreigners, the purification of the sanctuary took place, that is, on the 25th day of the same month, which was Kislev. They celebrated it for 8 days with rejoicing in the manner of, this is what we talked about last week, the
Sukkot.
The Feast of Booths, remembering how not long before, during the Feast of Booths, they had been wandering the mountains and caves like wild animals. Therefore, bearing ivy wreathed wands and beautiful branches, and also fronds of palm, they offered hymns of thanksgiving to him who had given success to the purifying of his own holy place. They decreed by public ordinance and vote that the whole nation of Jews should observe these days every year. So again, we're seeing that they did it, and then they later determined that every year they would do it. And we know from the letter to the Jews of Elephantine Island that eventually all Jews, not just the ones in Israel, are celebrating this holiday, probably Sukkot or second Sukkot. And so this is amazing, as we mentioned last week, because the evidence we have is unique. It's so interesting to be able to read, not like a piece on some sort of stone tablet, not just the biblical references, but references that are not in the Bible from an earlier time period. And any questions or thoughts? Stuart.
One of the things that caught my eye is when you were reading, I think it was from Maccabees 1, it said they celebrated for 8 days. Am I correct with that?
Yes,
Before.
exactly.
Pardon?
Yep, exactly. You're right.
If that's correct, we keep talking about celebrating holidays such as Passover for 8 days because we are no longer in Eretz Yisrael, and there's a question about the days.
That is a good point.
It's 7 or 8. How come all the way back then we have this 8 days when they still were in
the Bible,
the time zone?
in the Torah, Sukkot can be considered an 8-day holiday because there's an extra day at the end, whereas Passover is a 7-day holiday. So they're living in Israel. So this is pre-rabbis that added an extra day. So in Israel, it is 8 days according to the Torah. It's 8 days. It's 8 days everywhere according to the Torah. 7 days for Passover everywhere. It's not till centuries later when the rabbis decide that once you leave Israel, you will add an extra day. But it does say it is 8 days long, depending on how you look at it biblically. So those are little pieces of the Maccabees. Again, you can go online and read them anytime. Very interesting. Rambam, 12th century, says, for this reason, the sages of that generation instituted that these 8 days, beginning on the 25th day of Kislev, are to be days of rejoicing and praise to God. We are to kindle lights at evening at the entrance to our house on each of these 8 nights in order to show and reveal the miracle. Eventually, we start lighting candles ourselves. When did this start? Is Maimonides the first to say this? I don't believe so, but it does show that by the 12th century, we're already lighting candles. Where? In our home.
Spain. Oh, sorry.
Well, he was at the time. He was.
I'm sorry.
But he was living in Egypt when he wrote this.
Okay.
So we're doing it in our houses. This is not a communal celebration. We're celebrating in our houses, in our homes, to show and reveal the miracle. So it is very different than, say, all the other holidays, which you really celebrate together, save one major holiday, which you do at home, which is Passover. So this one is an evening in your house. And then this is Hanerot Hallelu, the praise of the candles that we say. We kindle these lights because of the miracles and wonders and salvation and battles that you performed. Again, the you, meaning God. During all 8 days of Hanukkah, these lights are holy. We are not permitted to make use of them, but rather only to observe them. This is one of the really rare rules we have for Hanukkah. What are we not allowed to do with the Hanukkah lights? They are purely ceremonial. So if I have the Hanukkah lights, I cannot use them to read a book, carry it to light my path in the house. So these are ceremonial only. Shabbat candles, which are not to be moved, can be used for reading in some ways, especially if you're studying, because you need it for certain prayers like, obviously, Birkat Hamazon, that you need for other things. So, main rule that is don't use the Hanukkah lights for anything purposeful beyond that's their Hanukkah lights. Now we get into some of the nuances of lighting the candles. One, and this is from the Talmud again, not in Hanukkah, it's in Tractate Shabbat. The rabbis taught the precept of Hanukkah requires one light for each man in his household. So, what does that mean? Everybody has their own menorah. Now, you may say man means only men. However, men plural can include women sometimes too. So that's a debate as to whether women can. A lot of people say women can light their own Hanukkah candles, even more traditionally. Those who seek to beautify the mitzvot kindle a single light for each household member. This is where we come. So concerning those who are particularly eager to beautify the mitzvot, so everybody gets to have a Chanukiah. 2 kids get one, even kids maybe, depending, can have their own, but usually they have to be old enough to light it, so kids can have their own Chanukiah. Beit Shammai says on the first night he lights 8 and then decreases in number each day. Beit Hillel says on the first night he kindles one light, and then he increases each day. This is the famous debate on Hanukkah. So we should know this. Beit Shammai says on day 1 of Hanukkah, you light all 8 candles. On day 2, you do 7. On day 3, 6. And on day 8, you light 1. Rabbi Hillel, or the House of Hillel, says on the first day you light 1, the second day 2, third day 3, and on the 8th day 8. We all know who wins the debates because Hillel wins every debate except for maybe 3. So Hillel always wins. But what is the compromise? So they believe, yes, we light 1 to increase the holiness each day. So Hillel wins, but what was the compromise?
Light them from the left to the right.
Exactly right. So you put the candles in new each week, but you light the newest one first. That was the compromise. So if you have 8 candles, you light the 8th one first, the one that you just put in for one night. That was the compromise. So you put in the candles right to left, and you light them left to right. You put them in Hebrew, you light them in English. Did I make sense of that? All right. So, but other people do however they want that, but that's when, okay. So now we come to some contemporary, and we talked a little bit. I did not talk about this. I forgot I talked about it when I was discussing Hanukkah last Saturday. Hanukkah becomes a bigger deal, as we know, in the 19th century and 20th century in America, because of its proximity to Christmas. But in Israel, Hanukkah has a renaissance as well. What is the Renaissance? What did the Maccabees do? They defeated the Greeks, they kick them out, and they take back Israel for the first time in 400 years. Why would this holiday resonate with Israelis? Because, I'm sorry, Karen?
No, I was going to say it sort of predicts foretells kind of what today has happened. They've taken the land back
Exactly.
from the British, the Ottomans, whomever.
The Israelis take the land back, and they do better than the Maccabees. The Maccabees took back the land 400 years later. Israel takes back the land 2,000 years later. The Maccabees were the last group to control Israel and not just have autonomous control, but to really to rule the country. The next group that rule the country are the Israelis. So as you can see, for Zionism, the story of the Maccabees' military success resonates with them. So Hanukkah became a little bit more important to them. They kind of ignore the part about the Maccabees being a little bit more religious and fighting the Hellenizing. But for them, it became a holiday of military prowess, taking back the land, taking control of your own destiny. And that's why. Now, of course, in Israel now they're starting to give a little bit of presence, kind of mimicking America. But obviously, Hanukkah can resonate with Israelis in ways that it can't with us. So let's read what Rabbi Irving Greenberg, who's an Orthodox rabbi, very not as tightly knit in paradigm, theme, and practice as other holidays. Hanukkah lends itself to being a type of holy day Rorschach test. Every community and generation has interpreted Hanukkah in its own image, speaking to its own needs. When rabbis asked what is Hanukkah, their answer focused on the purification of the temple and the miracle of the oil that burned for 8 days. As a new spiritual leadership dealing with the religious challenge of Jewry's survival after the loss of sovereignty and power, the rabbi stressed the divine miracle to the exclusion of military and diplomatic acts and the sovereignty exercised by the Maccabees, what we talked about. Similarly, medieval Jews focused on the divine miraculous activity in Hanukkah, projecting their own sense of helplessness and their longing for the messianic redeemer to do it all for them. This is a great analysis and a very easy way to understand. In the medieval period, and for a very long time, even beyond the medieval people, Jews saw themselves as powerless. In many places, they were persecuted, restricted, and they look at not the Maccabees and their military victory, but who? God winning the battle for the Maccabees, telling them that God is going to maybe do that for us one day. So they did not look at the Maccabees as winning the war, but as God doing it for them, which is the exact opposite of what modern Zionists would look at. They would look at, we're doing it ourselves. God gives us the onus. Whereas during difficult times, we ask for God to do it for us. As American Jews, we say to ourselves, God wants us to make the world better. That's because we're an empowered democracy where we have had hundreds of years of evolution and feeling that we can do things, that we are empowered. So let's make the world better. But if you live in an age where you are persecuted, restricted, and villainized, you want God to do it for you. And that's what he's going to say right here. In contrast, modern Zionists saw in Hanukkah a reflection of their agenda. They celebrated the Maccabee military prowess and political achievement. An early secular Zionist song proclaimed that a miracle did not happen to us. We found no cruse of oil. To these Zionists, the Maccabee state building was the eternal message of the holiday. For modern liberal Jews, Hanukkah became the holiday of religious freedom. The Maccabee fight was presented as an uprising of religious community against suppression. The Festival of Lights was a victory for and a living model of the religious tolerance that Jews sought in the modern world. We didn't talk about this, but they wanted religious freedom. What did we fight for in America and eventually get? Religious freedom. Our founders gave us a taste of it. Over the next 200 years, we fought for more until we have equality in many respects, certainly in our rights as human beings. To uphold this view, liberals had to filter out the fact that while the Hasmoneans fought for the right to practice their own religion, they were hardly pluralist. In fact, the Maccabees fought Hellenizing the Jews to the death and suppressed them as soon as they achieved power. So we talked about this as well, that the Maccabees would go into homes, forcibly circumcise babies, chastise people who weren't keeping kosher or following the laws. They were not, certainly the first couple of generations, they get better as time goes on, they were zealots and very strict. And lastly, similarly, American Jews have turned Hanukkah into the great gift-giving holiday. Other than children's games and very modest Hanukkah gelt, there was not much in the tradition of the holiday that supported an idea of an 8-day orgy of giving presents. But Christmas is so pervasive in America, and the children's sense of being shut out was so fierce that Hanukkah was rededicated as the season of giving. And we can look at it a really positive. Yes, there's a little bit much when we come to giving gifts. I can attest to that personally and honestly. But in terms of celebrating the holidays, and the brotherhood of humankind and religious freedom. It's a great holiday for us and has really done well by us. And so what I think it's done for a lot of people is, one, it makes us more confident, makes us more available to celebrate Christmas because we have our own holiday. Some parents do not want their kids seeing Christmas trees, understandable, but some are open to it, are watching Rudolph, or going to the Savannah Children's Theater's production of Rudolph. I don't know what rabbi would take their kids to that, or have their son take a picture with Yukon Cornelius and put it on Facebook. I couldn't do the picture of my daughter with Rudolph because Rudolph was a kid. I didn't want to put that picture up on Facebook. So it's given us a confidence. Sometimes we have to be careful, obviously, because we worry the confidence will encourage our children to look elsewhere for religion. But it's a fine line sometimes we walk. We have Jews who completely insulate themselves and don't allow anything in but their own viewpoint. And we have others who are more welcoming at the detriment in certain ways because their children may choose otherwise, but at the positives that we get modern education, modern thoughts. We get to promote Judaism to the rest of the world. Would America be so generous to the Jewish community if it hadn't been for liberal Jews promoting themselves and playing their part in American history? The answer, I think we all agree, is no. If we had been just very traditional Jews holed up in our little personal convoy, then what we see in America, I think, would be very different. And because we are in many ways, and not many ways, we were certainly, in some cases, not only the most renowned religious minority, and sometimes the only religious minority in America that people knew about. It helped pave the way for other religious minorities. There were not Muslims in America in the 18th century. There were Muslims here, very few, if any. There were very few Zoroastrians, very few Hindus or Buddhists. You did have, and of course, the 19th century, the migration of the Chinese, but they were not always considered welcome or invited to integrate, obviously, because they look very different. And that really had played a part, unfortunately. But because of Judaism being a minority religion where we fought for rights, we fought for America, we served on boards, we were good to our neighbors, we were philanthropic, we supported America, we sang the Star-Spangled Banner, we went, 500,000 of us went in World War II, we served in every war. Because we voted and we really represented ourselves well, I think that has helped a lot of minorities in America, especially religious minorities. You don't see a lot of persecution of minorities in our country religiously compared to other places. Obviously, we're the most, when it comes to acts of aggression against minorities, we're number one when it comes to religion, but it's nothing compared to what you'll see in other places. So there is Islamophobia, and there are people who don't like Zoroastrians or Sikhs or Muslims or Buddhists because they're different, but you don't see the legislative support for this. And that is very rare. Even in our history, it's very rare. Or judicial support. Karen.
Well, I was just thinking, well, we and the Muslims, there's so much we share with the Christians that any of the other religions do not. I mean, we're three Abrahamic, am I saying it right? Abrahamic religions, believe in the same God. So I think there's to some degree of acceptance, some degree of acceptance of us as Jews.
I think there's a lot of acceptance.
Well, yeah. I mean, we assimilated so well. Like you said, we didn't isolate ourselves in little, I don't want to call them ghettos, but little what's a better word than ghetto? Little communities that were, you know, totally Jewish or totally whatever.
And again, there is religious, there are religious issues in America, there is, but what we're seeing is it is not led or supported usually by the state.
Right.
Laws coming out saying Jews and Muslims can't do this. You see groups, individuals, when they restrict, it's often right now immigration, which has become a big issue, but they're not saying we're restricting Jews or Muslims. It's more restricting people from coming into America. In some cases, they are focusing on Muslims, but generally speaking, when it comes to religion, our country's laws, and David, you probably know better than me, there's been some restrictions in our history, but by and large, religious communities are supported by the state and by the majority of people as well, which has been really incredible. Again, it's the foundation of America anyway, Karen.
Well, I was just, I'm thinking about what I'm going to be talking about on Saturday, which is this immigration law that passed 100 years ago. Today I just looked this up on I don't know if all of you use or know about the CIA World Fact Book as a resource. Anyway, you can look up anything about any country. And we Jews are 1.9% of the population of the US. What might it have been had the immigration laws not been set 100 years ago to restrict how many Jews could come into this country? I wonder, would that number have been percentage-wise, would we have been a lot bigger percentage?
We would be a lot bigger, and
yeah.
People who didn't die in World War II and the stuff. But again, it wasn't just, that's probably the most famous law for restriction. It was aimed at Jews and other Europeans and Chinese, but I don't think the laws were directed. They don't say we limit specifically Jews because of their religion only. We're limiting all people and moving back the numbers by putting back the date of immigration.
Right. But the underlying
there's an underlying,
and their cause was definitely to keep us a Protestant nation. That's what it is, what it is.
Yeah.
So
if we could go back and change one thing, that might be it. All right, a pleasure. Now, in case we didn't get the information that Karen just mentioned, Saturday she's going to be speaking about the Johnson-Reed Act just during service. She's going to talk about it for 10 or 15 minutes, and during lunch, again, if you want to come up try and ask any questions, please feel free. Maybe we'll do something more about it later on. We can do histories of laws. Friday night at 5:30 is our big annual Hanukkah party. At 5:30 we'll start dinner. 6:45 we'll have the menorah lighting. 7 we'll have music and a service. And if they're interviewing, there'll be games for kids and adults. We make it for kids and adults. Obviously we have more adults. We make sure we have a lot of kids games so people can watch them playing as well. We'll have music. I forgot the name of the DJ. It's Jennifer Rich and her DJ, whatever her DJ name is. I forgot what it is. So it should be fun. You do need to RSVP because it is a paid dinner. And so please RSVP if you want to come for dinner. If you just want to come for the lighting at 6:45 or the service at 7, you don't need to pay, no worries. Any thoughts or questions? So that really, and also it doesn't pertain as much to in Sun City because I know there's a Hanukkah lighting in Bluffton, right? Well, it's probably the same.
There's a lot. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff going on here.
Yeah, so we have the city Hanukkah lighting that Chabad is leading Saturday the 29th at 3. Just give me when their Hanukkah lighting is in Bluffton. Don't just give me all the other stuff. I think it's the next day, isn't it? It's Monday.
Yes. Shalom Club is doing one. The Chabad is doing something, and Beth Yam is doing something. I guess on Hilton. There's a lot of.
But just
stuff
remember,
going.
We're the first and only people probably in Jewish history to eat latkes and sufganiyot.
Right.
Really,
Right.
your own groups, and we do both. So come early to get latkes, stay late to get this. Actually, we'll be doing sufganiyot at the same time. So look forward to it. And I put up the information on Facebook. It's also on the email that went out. So I hope to see you there. But if we don't, I want to wish everybody all the best. Happy Hanukkah. If you're celebrating other holidays, Merry Christmas. Wish everybody, if I don't see you, Happy New Year. We will not be having class, obviously, next week, as I'm out of town. And we won't be having class the week after, as I think it's the second, I think it's July 2nd, right? I forgot the week after.
January.
January
Not
1st.
July.
Yeah.
Oh,
So
Oh, is
our class
oh,
on.
yeah.
So have a great New Year's. And again, all our best. Thanks for joining us for the year 2024 on the Wednesday class that shall not be named on January 8th. We can talk about what we want to do for next year, if we want to do like one subject matter or continuing to do different ones throughout the year. All right, guys, such a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Rabbi,
Thank
can you hang
you.
on a minute? I want to
Sure.
chat with you for a second.
Okay, let me